Afternoon in the middle of the semester for our program today. I'd especially like to welcome several of our board members and donors, and as well as representatives of the university and college's administration. The General Buford Blount Professorship in Military History was founded in 2012 to honor General Blount, who's right here, who graduated from the University of Southern Mississippi in 1971 and went on to a distinguished career in the U.S. Army, which included, of course, leading the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division into Baghdad in 2003. The Dale Center for the Study of War and Society is extremely lucky to have such a distinguished partner as General Blount on our board, and such a notable academic post as the Blount Professorship in Military History as one of our posts. Unlike many name chairs or professorships which stay with the holder permanently, the Blount Professorship is actually designed to be shared among the faculty of the History Department. It is awarded biannually to provide funding to a member of the department who is working toward the publication of a major study in the field of war and society. At the end of their 2-year term, the holder of the Blount Professorship presents a lecture or program based on the findings of their research, which is why we're here today. In 2012, the first General Blount Professorship in Military History was awarded to Dr. Susannah J Ural, Professor of History and another co-director of the Center, the Dale Center for the Study of War and Society. Dr. Ural, who took her Ph.D. at the University of Michigan, at Kansas State University, sorry, inside joke, specializes in the U.S. Civil War era and is the author of several books, including most recently, Don't Hurry Me Down to Hades, The Civil War in the Words of Those Who Lived It, from Osprey Publishing, and her masterful study of the Northern Irish during the Civil War, The Harp and the Eagle, Irish-American Volunteers in the Union Army, 1861 to 1865, which I have my graduate students reading in about 2 weeks. Over the last 2 years, Dr. Ural has used the time and funding made available to her by the Blount Professorship to work on completing her 4th book, Hood's Boys, John Bell Hood's Texas Brigade and the American Civil War. That work is the subject of her talk this afternoon. Please help me give her a warm welcome to Dr. Susannah Ural.
Thank you, Kyle, and for that hit back on the University Degree Granting Institution. Thank you all for coming out today. Despite the challenges of parking in particular, we will have a gorgeous new parking lot available. It just wasn't available in time for this. General Blount, I want to thank you and Anita for the support you have not only provided yourselves, but really inspired from a lot of the supporters of the Dale Center that made the Blount Professorship possible. I also want to take a minute just to highlight some important things that are happening in the Dale Center period, because I'm an example of what can happen with the support you see through the Blount Professorship. But just today, one of my colleagues in the Dale Center, where are you? Where's Allison? There she is, Allison Abra, just got 2 phenomenal reader reports back on her forthcoming book, English Style, National Identity, Americanization of Popular Dancing in Interwar in Wartime Britain. My colleague Ken Swope, is Ken here? There you are. Ken, what did you published a book in, I think, 4 articles this year.
Yeah, last year.
Yeah, exactly, within the last 12 months. Our chair and fellow co-director, Kyle Zellner, while actually helping to run the entire history department, managed to get a book chapter out. I mean, I'm not touching on everybody. Heather and Andy Wiest are down in New Orleans interviewing veterans from the Vietnam War, Vietnamese veterans and members of that community, and that will be published in a study forthcoming. So I just want to kind of highlight the fact that I'm just one example of what's going on in the Dale Center and how much we appreciate all of the support that so many of you have provided to us. All right. I'm going to try and go through this slowly, and I'm going to try. I'm really excited about this. I've been doing this for pretty much 10 years now. But what I decided to focus my talk on was how the Blount Professorship has allowed me to ensure that this unit history, in many ways, this study of a brigade at war, can tell us about the larger Civil War experience within the United States from 1861 to 1865. And so when I was writing this book and researching it, I have thousands of letters and diary entries and memoirs and newspaper accounts. I have wonderful, wonderful data that I've gathered over the years. But the biggest problem I was running into with several key issues was that everything I had was anecdotal. I didn't necessarily have the numbers to firmly back up what I wanted to argue. And these points here, these 5 points, are what I want to touch on today in terms of what I've been using the last 2 years to really kind of wrap my head around and get actual hard data to support some of the conclusions, and where I've had to change some of my conclusions because I was just flat wrong. Which, better find out now than once the thing's in print. The first issue that I want to talk about, by the way, these are, any of you ever read the novel Lone Star Preacher? If you enjoyed the Civil War, it's hands down the best novel of the American Civil War. By a guy by the name of John W. Thomason, who Wade, you probably know, who's a Marine in World War I, wrote Fixed Bayonets, was his memoir from that. He also illustrated the book, so a lot of these illustrations are by Thomason throughout the talk. The first theory that I really wanted to test with the Texas Brigade had to do with their motivations to fight in the war to begin with and what really sustained them through the fighting. For those of you who don't know anything about the Texas Brigade, they're one of the elite units of the American Civil War, particularly really on either side, especially obviously for the Confederates. But they rank up there with the Iron Brigade, the Stonewall Brigade, a lot of the really just top-notch units that fought in the war. The core Texas units that were with the Irish Brigade, that was the other one, that were with the Texas Brigade from 61 to 65 are the 1st, 4th, and 5th Texas Infantry. You'll have some Georgians and South Carolinians with them early in the war. They get shifted out during a period of reorganization in the Army of Northern Virginia, and the 3rd Arkansas gets put in. So kind of the group that I'm talking about today has to do, I'll largely refer to them as Texans, but on occasion there's Georgians and Arkansans and South Carolinians in there too. The first question that I wanted to get at had to do with the question of why they volunteered in the first place. In particular, the question of nationalism. There's a long-standing argument within Civil War historiography, particularly dealing with the Confederacy, that Confederates always suffered from a lack of true nationalism, a true sense of identity as not only Southerners but as Confederates. And that this lack of this nationalism really plagued them throughout the war, and it's one of the reasons that the Confederacy was defeated. The historian Reed Mitchell, for example, he's a very well-known historian who's written on kind of motivation for service and Civil War soldiers in general. He's argued that the Texans were the least Confederate of all, because they're the furthest to the west. They were cut off from the rest of the Confederacy after Vicksburg falls and the Federals have control of the Mississippi River. And that really, if you want to find an example of true lack of nationalism, is the Texans. And I've been just kind of wrestling with this as I've been writing this book, because the Texans that I'm writing about have an amazing ability to shift their sense of nationalism. For one thing, the vast majority of soldiers who served in the Texas Brigade were not born in Texas. They were born elsewhere in the upper or the deep south, usually in states that became part of the Confederacy. But they came to Texas, most of them as children, were raised, therefore, originally as American citizens. A number of them come to Texas during the period of the Texas Republic. So they shift from identity of, say, a Tennessean with American national identity, shift to Texas national identity with the Republic of Texas. Then they very quickly manage to shift to Confederate national identity, and then they shift back to U.S. national identity after the war. I have found just about 0 examples of a lack of a sense of themselves as whatever they choose to call themselves. Most of the time, they are incredibly proud of themselves as Texans. That's the identity that pushed most of all. They will complain about the need to live up to that reputation, and yet they also take a tremendous amount of pride in it, which you see with a lot of groups. You see this with Irish soldiers as well, and a group that's very well known for this kind of rough and tumble reputation. The other issue that I've been wrestling with is the centrality of slavery in the war. And this question I dealt with pretty early on, and then what I've been able to do is just absolutely comb through the letters and the diaries that I have to find any kind of mention of slavery at all. When you look at the Texas Brigade, particularly the 3 units, they largely come from middle-class families. This is the 1st, 3rd, and 4th the 1st, 4th, and 5th Texas Infantry. They largely come from middle-class families in 1861. At that time, only 28% of Texans across the state owned slaves, and the majority of those owners were either small slaveholders or self-working farmers who often worked in the fields with the few slaves they owned. Historians like Charles Brooks have found similar parallels kind of with this general sweeping description of Texans within the Texas Brigade itself, where less than 1/3 of the original privates in the brigade were slaveholders. And of the enlisted men who owned slaves, they were almost all, again, these small slaveholders. The officers tended to own more, but when I got into the question of them actually wrestling with the question of slavery, dealing with the centrality of slavery within this war, that's where I had the biggest problem. The criticism that I often get is that I'm not dealing with slavery enough within the book. That it is central to the Civil War, which I fundamentally agree. I don't think you can take the slavery out of the war at all. But the problem I ran into was that Texans themselves were not wrestling with this. The biggest, I guess the best explanation I can give you is that I think we want them to wrestle with the institution of slavery far more than they wrestled with it themselves. If you've heard me talk about them before, this is one of those conclusions that I've been able to hold on to, and that further research just reinforced. When I find them talking about slavery in 1861 and 1862, even through 1863, it might be advising a wife to sell a slave, to borrow a slave from a neighbor, from a cousin. It might be a letter to tell some of the slaves he says hello, but he is not wrestling with this question of slavery like we do. When they do wrestle with it, it is overwhelmingly when they're being fired upon by black men in blue uniforms. And then it becomes a very clear theme running through their letters. Bless you. 21 October 1864 is one of the most powerful examples of this. Samuel Watson in the 1st Texas was writing a letter home, and he described, quote, "them bloody Negroes of Grant's," he used a different word, "of Grant's made a charge on us, and a charge it was. They came right up till you could see the white of their eyes. The boys literally covered the ground with dead Negroes. Don't think I'm bragging, for it is so." And letters like that, then they do get vicious. But I've never been able to come up with any kind of early wrestling with the institution of slavery. And again, I think it's a wonderful reminder of why you don't want to force them to be people they aren't. The fact of it's just the ugly truth of it. They're not that troubled by it, period. End of story. In terms of one of the other interesting things I've discovered with the Texas Brigade, in terms of what made them such an elite unit. I remember talking with the military historian Jeremy Black about the Texans and kind of asking him, kind of wrestling with this, and I remember telling him that some of their strongest officers were at the company and regimental level, and that I was wondering if this is central, and he's just looking at me like, yeah, you think so? Having strong commanders at that level, it was absolutely essential to the Texans dealing with the casualty rates that they'll go through, having men able to step up and fill the voids as other officers are killed. I don't know how many of you know anything about the Texas Brigade. I've heard me talk about them. They have tremendously high casualty rates at the Battle of Antietam or Sharpsburg, Gettysburg, Chickamauga, the Wilderness. Antietam is where the 1st Texas gets the reputation for suffering the most casualties of any regiment on either side in the entire war. Suffer 83% casualties for a regiment. What you find is a couple of things. One or two of these I already knew. One was that the Texans tended to like the officers that rebelled against this kind of upper crust proper officer image. They tended to like officers who clearly were willing to go in and do anything that they were asking the men to do. But what they also tended to support were the officers who would also crack down when they needed to crack down and didn't tend to abuse this. Just the classic things that you tend to identify in strong officers. John C. Upton is a great example of this. Commanded the 5th Texas. He was known for rejecting a traditional officer's uniform. He preferred to go into battle in an old pair of pants, a thoroughly worn in and nearly worn out pair of cavalry boots, an old cotton shirt, slouched black hat, oversized saber, a pair of 6-shooters, and randomly he will be described as carrying a frying pan in a battle, including the Battle of Gainesville. Okay? So this classic kind of frontier image that the Texans were constantly living up to, complaining about, and yet trying to live up to at the same time. Upton does this for them. Howdy Martin, And the 4th Texas was known for his rejection. He didn't like the formal military salute. Every time somebody tried to salute him, he'd just say howdy. Hence he gets the nickname Howdy Martin. You know, but he's known for giving these kind of fiery, the men tend to refer to them more as sermons than speeches. And one Texan describes Martin as he leapt up on an old goods box under a hickory tree. Long, angular, with a voice like thunder. He would shake his long hair as he spoke and looked like he was mad enough to eat a Yankee raw. And it's also Howdy Martin, of course, who will be with the 400+ men who surrender at the end of the war at Appomattox Courthouse, and he leads them back to Texas. That's another project. I don't want to get too far off, but that's another project that the Blount Professorship let me dig into, where I've been working with one of my graduate students, Alan Branstetter, to chart these men as they surrender at Appomattox and go home to Texas and live into the post-war period. One of the areas where I disagree with the historiography, there's one of these standing theories that when the men go home for a long period of time, they just don't want to talk about the war. They just want to get back to peace. And the problem I've always had with this is, if you know anything about Civil War units, they're organized within towns and counties. Everybody knows each other. Everybody grew up together. This isn't like kind of a modern draft. And so I'm just like, you went home with your cousin and your neighbor and your uncle, and you guys just didn't talk about it? You didn't get together at all? Maybe, but maybe not. I'm just not tracking that. And so what Alan and I have been doing, and we're going to continue to do, and this is partly inspired by a digital history workshop that we were allowed to be part of, thanks in part to the Dale Center and thanks in part to the university as a whole. We're going to map the 400 guys as they come home from Appomattox, well, for you guys, come home from Appomattox Courthouse, I can't do it backwards, to Texas, and follow them into the 1870s, looking at how the war really changed their lives, or maybe didn't necessarily change a whole lot at all. Last but not least, I want to deal with John Bell Hood. I was recently talking with one of our great supporters, Wade Benson, who Wade asked me the other day, you got to explain Hood. If any of you know anything about the Civil War, you know that John Bell Hood, who has those wonderfully sad eyes, does not emerge from the American Civil War with a very strong reputation as a commander, particularly due to the fighting around Atlanta and the fighting in Tennessee, particularly Franklin and Nashville. So the question is, how do you explain Hood? The way I explain Hood is that when the Hood's Texas Brigade veterans were organizing themselves into a veterans association, they had multiple brigade commanders for whom they could have named themselves. And in the 1880s, when they formed their veterans organization, they named themselves the Hood's Texas Brigade Association. After Franklin, after Nashville, after Atlanta, after everybody and their mother is attacking John Bell Hood. And when you look at them talk about Hood after the war, their general consensus is, I'm not entirely sure what went wrong with everybody else, but when Hood was with us, everything went wonderfully. Now, part of that is their own arrogance. Part of that is due to Hood as a superb regimental commander. He is a superb brigade commander. He's a pretty decent division commander. Once he gets above division and he gets up to corps and army command, it's just not a strong suit at all. And there's no defending it, I can't. But what I do want to do is give you a description of John Bell Hood. John Bell Hood in the good years, in the good days. But I want to give this description to you so you understand some of why they so identify with Hood. The Texans' first big fight in the Civil War was a battle called Gaines' Mill that was on just outside of Richmond in Virginia. And basically what they do is plug a hole in the Confederate line that allows the Confederates to launch an attack against entrenched Federal units. To basically describe what it is, they come in fairly late in the fighting, they come in fairly disorganized so that the brigade is actually separated. The 4th Texas and the 18th Georgia plugs a hole over here, while the 1st and 5th Texas wind up over here. It's the 4th Texas and the 18th Georgia that get involved in some of the heaviest fighting. What they have to do is go down a hill. How many of you ever walked Gaines' Mill with Bosun's Creek? Okay, you know what I'm talking about. So you have to go down this hill to Bosun's Creek. You have to get across the creek. And once you get across the creek, the Federals are 3 lines deep, entrenched, and behind them is Federal artillery. Now, the reason the Texas Brigade is actually able to, along with the help of some Georgians and South Carolinians who never get any credit, are actually able to break through this line is 2 reasons. One, there were attacks that came before them that have weakened the Federals. But two, Hood, and here's where Hood's kind of aggressiveness works to his advantage, realizes that if they kind of slowly advance, this is never going to work, and he tells the men to fix bayonets, move as fast as you can across this open ground down to the creek. They manage to just literally overwhelm the Federals on the other side of the creek, including with the fixed bayonets, pushing through that line, push up the other side of the hill, and actually take that Federal artillery and, believe it or not, break up. It was fairly disorganized, but a Federal cavalry attack. And there's some great letters from the guys who were trying to form square, like they've been reading some, some Napoleon here and trying to figure this out. It's early in the war, and they're like, I think this is what we do. But that was Hood who led them in this first fight. It was Hood who really helped them first get a name for themselves. And that's the kind of regimental level commanders, company level commanders that you see in the Texas Brigade that made them one of the elite units they are. And just to give you a description of the other reason they loved Hood, their fight at Gaines' Mill was not their bloodiest, but it was certainly devastating as one of their first fights and their first experience in heavy combat. The 18th Georgia lost 145 of its 507 men that day. The 4th Texas lost 250 to 261 men. They were never sure. And they had entered the fight with about 530 to 540 men. That night, a Mississippian recalled that, quote, glimmering lights scattered far and wide over the field. It was the most miserable night of my life. And there was Hood, out there with his brigade, scouring the route of their attack, looking for the wounded and the dead. Soldiers reported that they heard him late into the night calling for stretchers. Hood loaned his horse to Texan Jake Smiley, who had located the bodies of his 2 dead brothers and wanted to bury them together. Late that night, a staff officer found Hood sitting on a cracker box, sobbing, finally breaking down, but ensuring that the men would not see him. I can't overemphasize how important this battle was to them, and what an excellent example this is of kind of those field and company grade officers who made the Texas Brigade as successful as it was. And I guess my final bit of evidence that I could offer you is every year when the veterans got together, they got together on June 27th, the anniversary of the Battle of Gaines' Mill. So, lastly, and this I came across just probably within the last 6 months. I don't know why this didn't hit me before. Every single one of these guys is a middle-class officer. They are not of the planter class. They're not exceptionally wealthy. Dugal Williams of the 5th Texas, he is very wealthy by the time the war begins, but he's a very unusual, he's not a member of the planter class at all. He's a steamboat captain, very much a self-made man before the war. But these men basically are all men who have made themselves, if you will, if you want to use a 19th century term, and represent the success that so many Confederates were desperately trying to hang on to. Now, here's the biggest question I had, and where I've probably done the most exhausting digging. The question of desertion is a huge one in the Civil War. Both sides suffered from major problems with desertion as the war dragged on. I mean, the dwindling morale is always an issue. But by 1864, Robert E. Lee is complaining within the Army of Northern Virginia of major, major problems with desertion. Where's that stat I want to show you guys? Lee's complaint is basically that there are tremendous chunks of his army. He said about 5,000 men were absent without leave. Several hundred others, about 300 some others, were listed as deserters in the spring of 1864 when they needed the campaign season to start. The question I always get with the Texas Brigade is, how are their ranks looking by 1864, which is when most units are starting to dwindle, particularly among the Confederacy? And number two, what have you found on desertion? And what I always had to answer in the past was not much. Now, with Texas audiences, that always plays wonderfully. They're like, absolutely not much, we don't desert. With everybody else, they're like, really, seriously, come on. But here was the problem, I really wasn't finding much. If you want to get into the questions of desertion, there are several routes you can follow. There is a gentleman by the name of Jack Bunch, who has published a listing of the 20,000 men who came up on courts-martial charges during the Civil War. And on one of my efforts to dig into this, I won't go on to this too far because that'll be painful for you as it was for me. I went through this and basically tried to find every single guy who was brought up on some sort of charges between 1861 and 1864 who had served in the Texas Brigade, and shock of all shockers, I found out that they came up on charges in the winter of 1863-64, overwhelmingly. I'm going to get into it in a second why that isn't all that surprising. Then I went through the Richmond Daily Dispatch, which was the main Richmond, Virginia newspaper, which talks about a lot of the aspects of the Civil War and soldier life that you don't often hear about, which is when they're not actually fighting, when they're actually getting into trouble, and when they're not nearly as popular and as fondly remembered as soldiers are from the American Civil War by living Americans today. There I found a whole bunch of really fascinating stories. A Texas Brigade officer, he was enlisted, trying to break into a woman's home who had a skull cracked open when she hit him with a frying pan. Here comes the frying pan again. Random stuff, you know, but none of it proved anything. I have a lot of really cool stories that I could then add to the manuscript, but I was sitting there racking my brain because I really didn't have anything substantial. And what I knew was that there were major problems in the Texas Brigade during this time period. In the winter of 1863-1864, the commander of the Texas Brigade, the guy on the right there, Jerome Bonaparte Robertson, for any of you wondering about the Napoleonic influence on the American Civil War, there you go, Jerome Bonaparte Robertson. They're everywhere. You see all these French names, particularly the Napoleonic marshals. He is charged with several things by First Corps Commander James Longstreet, but most particularly, J.B. Robertson is charged with basically breaking the morale of Confederate soldiers because he is openly complaining about the fact that they are not supplied with enough food, without proper shelter. They don't even have proper shoes. He's talking about a number of the men walking around barefoot, that this is not conducive to any kind of basic health that these men are going to need when the campaign season opens again in the spring of '64. J.B. Robertson was particularly concerned about this because in his pre-war years he was a doctor. This is what he does for a living. He's worried about these issues. Longstreet was absolutely furious in an almost Stonewall Jackson-esque rage. Jackson was notorious for bringing officers up on charges. Longstreet charges Robertson with basically diminishing morale and has him arrested. The court's martial trial will find Robertson not guilty, but basically his reputation has been tarnished. There's questions about his ability as a brigade commander, and Robertson is sent west. Which meant that from about November of '64 through November of '63 through February, March of 1864, the Texas Brigade was under the command of a colonel, who also had to take care of commanding his own regiment, as well as the entire brigade. And I also came across, again, anecdotally, but a number of descriptions of just how bad things got within, kind of during this time period in 1864. James Manahan writes a letter from camp, Company E, 4th Texas. He describes the campaign, kind of that winter period, as the hardest campaign we ever went through. We've made several long marches over frozen ground, and nearly all the men barefooted, myself included. Again, what he's talking about is the fighting went very late into the fall of 1863. We have had hard corn issued to us for our rations, but notwithstanding all this, the men are in fine spirits, confident of success as they were when the war began. We all know that the darkest hours of our nation's trouble is now upon us, but we put our trust in the God of battles and our own right army. J Gore served on Longstreet's staff. And there you go, there's a picture of J Gore. Served on Longstreet's staff while 3 of his 4 brothers served in the 5th Texas. Thomas J Gore wrote that same February a little more clearly about the situation in the Texas Brigade. He said, "It is not the condition I would desire to have it. The morale of it is bad. They have got it into their head to go across the Mississippi, and many have gone without leave. I hope, however, soon to see a great improvement." And Gore in this letter blames morale more on Robertson than on conditions and lack of supply in Tennessee. When John Gregg, who you see on the right there, recovered from the wound he received at the Battle of Chickamauga the previous September, and he shows up to take command of the Texas Brigade, he's absolutely horrified. Writes a confidential, as written on it, letter to his friend back in Texas. He says, "You know, when I took command of the Texas Brigade, General Robertson had been absent a long time. Colonel Bryan not even having the first officer of a regiment, could not reasonably exercise the influence which a brigade commander might. And the consequence was that I found the brigade a little body of malcontents, some of them deserting every day or two, having, I suppose, present for duty, about 500 muskets. So, this is the Texas Brigade, who's being described as a little body of malcontents in the spring of 1864. So this is why I knew something was going on in the winter of 1863-64, but I was having trouble tracking down and proving exactly what. Hold on. There you go. You can look at this. I won't let you look at the other one just yet. My suspicion was twofold. Number one, that a number of the men were taking French leave. They would go visit family in North Carolina, elsewhere in Virginia, Tennessee, get healthy over that winter, get away from some of those conditions over that winter, get healthy, and be ready to come back to the fight. And again, there's a very famous story that would support this about John Bell Hood. Another officer was commenting to Hood, you know, where are the Texans? I'm not even seeing any of them in camp. And Hood had just kind of smiled. This was early in the war when he was a brigade commander, and said, don't worry, you know, when it comes time for a fight, they'll show up. And it was one of the reasons they liked him. He kind of knew when to let go of the reins a little bit, and he knew when to kind of pull back on them. So I wondered, okay, are some of the guys just leaving? And of course, I did have an example of this. J Gore, in one of his other letters, talks about his brother Scrap visiting family in North Carolina. And it's nice to have a brother on Longstreet staff. You actually got permission to leave. But he comes back, and J Gore talks about the fact that it did Scrap a world of good, just getting away for a few weeks with a real bed, real food, loving family, warm fire, kind of describing the improvement. But what I wanted was numbers, and here's what I found. Of the men wounded in 1862 and 1863, we have a tendency to assume that the killed, wounded, and missing are out pretty much for good. Some of the wounded may come back, but if they have any kind of a severe wound at all, the likelihood, I was thinking, was that they generally weren't coming back. Overwhelming casualties at battles like Sharpsburg in the summer of 1863, tremendous casualties suffered by the Texas Brigade at Gettysburg and Chickamauga. But what I found was that 326 men, so if they only had 500 in the ranks in the spring of 1864, 326 show up and return to fight in 1864 who come from previous wounds. And here was the other surprise we found just recently, and there are 4 new recruits. One of them deserts, though, after 2 days. So there are 3 new recruits in 1864. Total in the ranks of people who are not only returning from wounds from the previous 2 years, but showing up from, I'm not entirely sure where, but for the fighting in 1864, I have 1,360 men. And I'm so excited I can't even say that number with the 1,300. Because this was my problem that I kept running into. For the men who were wounded once in the campaign season of 1864, if you guys don't know this would be a lot of these battles. Wilderness, Spotsylvania, North Anna, Cold Harbor, the Petersburg Campaign, White Oak Swamp, Chafin Farm, and most significantly Darbytown Road, which was another big fight to defend Richmond. If you look at these casualties, we have 548, all these other casualties totaling about 815 guys. Well, according to Gregg's letter, when he first found the men, he had 500. When he goes into the fight at the Wilderness, he has 800, but they suffer over 400 casualties. Now, my math is not good at all, but even I knew something was absolutely wrong there. I did this 2 ways. I don't know, I don't want to bore you guys with too much of this, but this is really cool, and just work with me on it. 2 things. One, I got together with J.T. Johnson, who on campus supports faculty doing a tremendous amount of this research that we do, and I told him I want to come up with a statistical sample. I have this book that has the names and a little bit of information about the over 7,000 guys who ever served in the Texas Brigade. And I want to do a sample. And I'm thinking about this, and I talked to some of my colleagues, including Kyle Zellner, who've done samples before. It's like, you sure? I'm like, no, I'm serious. I really want to do this. And so, with some of the money that, between the Blount Professorship and another award, I was able to hire Alan Branstetter. I'm like, all right, here's what we're going to do. And we created the sample to tally all these numbers up, and not only did I find out that the desertions were, where's my number? Dang it! Not only did I find that the desertions were particularly low. Where are my desertions? Dang it, y'all. All right, I'm just going to tell you about it. I have literally 95 desertions for the entire war from the sample. And I have 19 just for 1864. So, now this is 95 based on about a 25% sample, so it's, you know, representative there. But what I basically found was that the Texas Brigade did indeed have exceedingly low desertion rates. And what I've been able to conclude in the manuscript is that my general instincts were right. Number one, if you're in Texas and you don't want to be serving that far away from home, you want to be fighting closer to home, you don't want to be 1,000 miles away in Virginia, you didn't sign up for the Texas Brigade in the first place. You signed up for the Texas units that were going to be fighting closer to home. Number two, if you were going to desert, you deserted pretty early in the war. And we have found two kind of desertion spurts. One is in 1861. Remember that list of officers I showed you earlier? You notice there's only one guy from the 1st Texas? The 1st Texas was the first unit organized of Texas volunteers right when the war begins. They literally start organizing before Fort Sumter. They don't even have permission. Actually, they have specific instructions from Jefferson Davis that the Confederate government will not fund them. He wants them to stay in Texas. And classic Texans, they refuse to do so, and they go to Virginia anyway. I mean, these are the guys I've classified as either really kind of true believers, they fundamentally believe in this war, or you might classify them as hotheads. And sure enough, in the first 3 companies organized out of the 1st Texas, I still remember, Al, when you were working on this, you're like, what's up with all the guys deserting in New Orleans? Like 7 days after they signed, 2 days after they got mustered in, but 7 days after they originally agreed to join the unit. And what ends up happening is a number of these guys were just like, well, wait a minute, I'm not going all the way to Virginia. I mean, this is nuts. I mean, I'm signing up, but I'm going to defend Louisiana. I'm not defending these. Virginia can defend Virginia. I mean, this classic kind of states' rights kind of argument. And that kind of an attitude plagued the 1st Texas. They did not have nearly the number of really strong officers like you see in the other units. The other spurt of desertions that we found is over that winter of 1863, 1864. They have far more desertions over that winter. Now, far more, 21. But from including kind of the fall of 1863 is how I got up to 21. But far more there than you do at any other period in the war. Okay, now, I know I won't bore you with all this. Last but not least, if you look at these casualties that the Texans suffer, and if you look at the total number in the rank in 1864, those who suffer 1 wound, those who come back and actually suffer a 2nd wound, there's one guy, by the way, who's wounded 4 times in 1864. That is how the Texas Brigade is able to keep fighting in that last big year of the war, which was the huge question that I wanted to get answered. Last but not least, I want to touch on 2 issues that also kind of set the book apart and make sure that I can contribute beyond traditional military history, but really have the book play within the field of war and society as a whole. I don't know of any unit history that talks about the families on the home front, not a single one, including some really good unit histories like Al Nolan's The Iron Brigade, for example, that talk about the home front. When a lot of us study the American Civil War, we want to look at the men who are doing the fighting. It's a pretty natural instinct, but when you look at their letters, they're always looking home. I mean, that's what they're thinking about the most, that's what they tend to be writing about the most. And what I wanted to do was track what was happening to a lot of the families at home as well and kind of incorporate them into the book, which is what I've done. One of the main players is a woman by the name of Erskine, who was able to show around Seguin, Texas, where a lot of the men in the 4th Texas were raised. She talks about September of 1862, when the home communities had promised to support the war effort and the soldiers' families. But she was absolutely disgusted. She wrote to her husband, who actually, she loses her father-in-law that summer just on a cattle drive. She loses her brother in August of 62. She loses her husband in September of 62. But right before that, one of the last letters he got from her, and she's absolutely furious about what's going on at home. She said, I think it is hard for you all to leave your homes and fight for a lot of skinflints as are left here. There is no price too high for them to ask for anything. Coffee, $3 per pound. everything else at the same rates. I cannot hire a hand for any price. And someone has told such dreadful tales about the ferry boat that nearly all the travel was on the other road. They ran a stage stand, an inn, a ferry boat, they had a ton of things going on. But one of the things I wanted to show was that we tend to view a lot of these men and their families through fairly rose-colored glasses, forgetting that just people are people and they're going to do some of the nasty things in war just like they do any other time, including literally creating reputations about the Erskine's ferry so that some of the business goes to another guy down the road instead of this guy who's off serving in the war. Things grew worse in 1863 in terms of those inflation rates, and like many other southern states, like Texas tried to respond to this demand. At the end of November, the state legislature passed a joint resolution that clarified the government's, quote, support and maintenance of soldiers' families during their absences from home. Now, it took another 2 weeks, naturally, for them to pass the law, but they set aside $1 million annually for the families, widows, and dependents of soldiers currently serving in state or Confederate forces, or soldiers killed or disabled in service. Chief justices of Texas counties drafted lists of the soldiers' dependents in their counties eligible for relief, and a number of the families found help in this manner. Now, as you go through these records, you come across little things like a judge in Walker County, where a number of the Texas Brigade soldier lives, a judge by the name of Smither. He grumbles, just this little note in there where he's grumbling about the local poor families have already been supplied with cloth cards and other assistance. He completely disagrees that they need any kind of further assistance. His nephew, Mark Smither, was serving in the 5th Texas. But Smither insisted that the families can supply not only for themselves, but to spare. But while there is a show to get goods otherwise, no efforts are made to manufacture. And he does submit the list of soldiers' families who've registered themselves, but he crosses out the names of those who he decides are not such as are contemplated by law. Now, one of the other things I did with the book was take a look at the Confederate home. This is my last but not least, so just stay with me here because this is one of my favorite parts. When I talk about moving beyond the reunions, one of the things I wanted to do was dispel this image of veterans as basically, Confederate veterans seem a lot in common with Union veterans. They basically all have this shared experience that causes them to be friends. Certainly by the early 20th century, they forget about the central role of slavery in the war and everybody moves beyond this. My problem with this is almost everything we discuss about post-war memories with veterans has to do with published memoirs, minutes from reunion meetings. Overwhelmingly, it has to do with the people who were wealthy enough to attend reunions or to publish any sort of memories or anything that they did in the war. What I wanted to get at were the people who didn't do that, who couldn't write letters, didn't have this economic stability to save those letters, and through an just uncivilized amount of hours in Ancestry.com, what I finally decided was that if I tried to do this for everybody, I'm not going to be able to track them all. And so what I did was I tracked down the 75 guys who wound up at the Confederate home in Austin, Texas. To gain entrance to these homes, just like Beauvoir down on the coast, you had to prove basically prove your poverty. Overwhelmingly, this meant that a lot of the men had already applied for pension support after the war, and if you know anything about these records, pension applications were largely coming in, some of them in the 1880s, overwhelmingly in the 1890s and early 20th century. They list what their income is, they list any kind of property that they have, they list any kind of wounds they received in the war, and there has to be testimony included from fellow soldiers to prove that the men served honorably. So what I was able to do was with these 75 men at the Confederate home, put them into the book to get in some of these experiences of men who otherwise we know absolutely nothing about, other than that they served in the Texas Brigade. And maybe we even know that. And what we know, just to give you one of the stories, is of the Blue family. The 4 Blue brothers were from Washington County, Texas. They served under King Brian and Watson Dugan Williams. Before the war, they were one of the wealthiest in the county. They owned 18 slaves with real estate valued close to $16,000 and a personal estate at about $10,000. This is their father. But by the time you get to the late 1890s and early 1900s, C.D. Blue entered the Confederate home in Austin in 1899. His brother, W.G., followed him there about 11 years later. Both were senile, CD suffered from rheumatism. And they lived out their days at that home there on the hill in Austin until WGG died 7 days after the Hood's Texas Brigade Monument was dedicated in Austin. Likely, he may have seen some of his friends because they all tended to visit the home whenever they had a reunion in Austin. But what I was able to do was piece together stories. They aren't huge. I mean, the record is still a challenge, but I'm able to show how their finances have dramatically changed because of the war. I'm able to show bits and pieces about who these people were before the war as opposed to afterward, and actually get into the historiography, the experiences of a lot of Civil War soldiers who we've otherwise forgotten.